Hello everyone, welcome back to my latest video on my history channel. I would like to speak about something that is still a vital part of India's legacy, as in a recent part of history that still very much affects us today, namely the British Raj, and how it systematically looted India of its resources and wealth, and how it still and how its actions and policies still impact us to this day. Now, of course, the British Raj has impacted us a lot. Like for instance, the English language, with which I'm still talking in this video, with which we all communicate in our offices. Essentially, English is the official language of this country alongside Hindi. That and the laws we follow, like our Indian Penal Code, um, and some of our other laws like Indian Evidence Act and all. Of course, as of July 2024, these have been substituted with new laws with the more based on the modern Indian reality. But the foundation of these laws was the laws that was passed in the British era. So again, the British Empire, the British Raj, as the empire that ruled over India was called, it still impacts us very significantly. Even the tea we drink, all of that, the tea we drink or our national sport cricket that we all are so obsessed with, all of that was brought to us by the British. Now, a lot of people, mostly people in the West and even here in India, believe that because of all this, the British Empire was supposedly a very beneficial part of our history, that the British were like God-given gifts to us. But were they really? As it happens, a lot of literature has been released in recent years, particularly a book by Shashi Tharoor called Era of Darkness, which has done much to cast aspersions on this incorrect assumption. All of these people have done much to show us how, how whatever the British brought to us was really in their own self-interest, and how much the British actually destroyed India, how they robbed us of our resources, how they made us poorer than we were before they arrived here in India. Now the title of this video is India's $1 trillion heist, which is most appropriate because of the sheer amount of wealth the British took from this country. Now how much they took and how they took it, that I will state further. So when the British first arrived in India, it was not the British government themselves. The British first arrived in the form of a private trading enterprise called the East India Company. They first made their base in Bengal, and initially when they first arrived, they arrived as traders. They bought our goods, and they paid us in gold and silver as it used to be back then. Then, before the British officially started to rule over India, the rule started, you could say, in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey, when Robert Clive of the East India Company won over the then ruler of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and laid the foundation of the British Raj in India. Of course, Bengal was the start. Later on, it would spread all over India slowly, ending with the conquest of the Punjab in 1849, just a couple of years before the 1857 revolt. Now, before the British first started their rule in Bengal, I would like to tell you all what was India's state at the time. In modern terms, we all talk about how much economies contribute to the global GDP, gross domestic product. It's a measure of income that is earned per person or per country, per group of people, based on each country and all worldwide. So India, as it turned out, was one of the biggest contributors to the world GDP. That is, it was something around 27%. If you can believe it, 27% share of the global GDP in those times, around 1700. This was around 57 years before the Battle of Plassey that established the British rule in India. At that time, India was known as the world's leading manufacturing center. It's difficult to imagine this considering how much we Indians have struggled with the manufacturing center. We Indians still today import a lot of stuff from abroad, especially when it comes to the defense materials or other stuff. We usually deem Indian goods as inferior and foreign goods as superior, but that is really because of what the British did to us, and moreover the beliefs they imparted in us after they began. Before the British started their rule, India was contributing 27% to the global GDP and was the world's leading manufacturing and trading center, if you can believe it. Yes, it was that much so. In back then, especially when it comes to Bengal, the weavers of Bengal were very well known. The muslin weavers, you could say. There is this cloth called muslin ware with which they used to produce good fabrics, which would be bought by the East India Company people themselves and by other people abroad. These goods, the muslin cloth with which the Bengali weavers used to weave the fabrics, it was said to be literally light as air. It was so soft, so smooth, and essentially this fabrics and this cloths and even other goods, I would say, I do not know much, but the most prominent is the textiles of Bengal. They used to, not just the British but even other European powers and other foreign countries or foreign kingdoms, as it used to be back then, used to buy them. In fact, it is we even used to export a lot of these goods to the Roman Empire. In fact, it is said that so much exports used to be made that the Roman treasury was almost bankrupt, so the Roman emperors banned the imports of Indian goods. It was, Indian goods were that highly sought after. And of course, everybody knows about the Indian spices. Our traders, they were some of the best merchants in the world. Our artisans, our craftsmen, they produced world class goods, especially when it comes to textiles, as I have said earlier about the Muslim cloth. So before the British Raj, it was we were literally the biggest contributors to the world economic productivity, 27%. Imagine that. But once the British started establishing their rule over India, they started with Bengal and then spread on to other kingdoms until 1849. Shortly after the 1857 revolt, which it failed sadly, the British crown took over and the Indian colony began to be governed directly from London by the British government itself. So in over 2 centuries, from 1757 onwards till 1947, when we finally attained our independence, and even 3 years afterwards, around 1950, when India first became a fully democratic republic, our ties from the British crown completely severed. Until 1950, even though we were officially independent, we were essentially a dominion. We still had some ties to Britain politically. It was only in 1950, with the adoption of the constitution, that our ties to Britain were fully severed and we became a fully functional independent republic. So once the British were done with India around 47 to 50, our share of GDP had fallen to a meager 3%. Imagine that, from top producers we went to the bottom level. We were from being one of the world's more richest regions in the world, we had literally become, to put it bluntly, a poster child for third world poverty, as the Western countries would contemptuously label other countries apart from themselves. So how did this happen? This happened because of policies that the British enacted during their era, by which they ruthlessly extracted resources from India for their own benefit, while contributing pretty much nothing to the development and welfare of the Indian people, whom they, in their hypocrisy, dared to claim that they governed on their behalf. And the decline was, needless to say, pretty systematic. This happened in such a way that before the British era we were an exporter of goods. Even today we are. In fact, like I said earlier, in the Roman era, in the pre-British era, we used to export so much goods that in the case of the Roman Empire, they literally threatened to ban imports of Indian goods simply because their treasury was becoming bankrupt by the craze for Indian goods. The history is being repeated now in the modern times as well, with the USA moving to restrict imports of Indian goods as well. Essentially, history is being repeated. Just as the Romans tried to ban imports of Indian goods, so the Americans are doing the same now. But during the British era, because of all the policies they enacted, this our the essentially in the Indian industry of the time, it was usually the cottage industry, the artisans, weavers, and all who used to produce world-class quality goods. They were their livelihoods and all were destroyed, and many of them were rendered poor. So what happened was, because of which this from being a supplier of world class goods, the British forced us to rely on their goods uh, for for our for consumption. The British forced us to rely on their textile made goods and all for consumption, and that too at exorbitant prices. So essentially we became poor in a relatively short amount of time, and from being a supplier we became an importer. The situation is being redressed, but it's not yet fully done. Even today we import a lot of goods. In the agricultural sector we are thankfully an exporter again, but in a lot of other sectors, we are, especially the manufacturing sector, we still we still are yet to regain the position that we held prior to the British. So I would like to speak further on how the British went about destroying India, to put it bluntly. So there was this fellow, a very famous one, Dadabhai Naoroji. He was one of the British educated Indians. He was even elected to the British Parliament in the 19th century. So he had proposed a theory back in Britain. I think he even proposed it in the Indian Parliament also. It was called the drain of wealth. It is there he talked about how the British, using unfair and crooked policies, they systematically looted India's rich resources for their own benefit without giving anything back in return to the Indian people. So uh, there is this in today's times, way back in 2019, there was this economist called Usha Patnaik, a very renowned economist. She I don't know if she's still there, but she used to be a professor emeritus at Delhi's JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. It's very well known. It appears in news today for many political reasons, for the wrong reasons really, but still she's a very famous economist. So she had calculated how much the British looted from India during their rule. That is between the period of 1765. 1765 was when the British fought a second battle to annex another region of India called the Battle of Buxar. During this time, the British took a further step towards consolidating their rule over India. From then on, it was a one-way step to expansion. Between 1765 and she had based the final ending period at 1938 or 1946, I should say, a year before India's official independence. So between 1765 and 1946, how much monetary worth of wealth was taken away by the British from India, as in looted, robbed, so to speak? Here is the answer: 45 trillion dollars. Imagine that. That's a tremendous amount of wealth. In fact, they say that it is 17 times more than the current GDP of the UK in modern times, which is around 3.96 trillion dollars, which means between two centuries the British took that much, a lot. The British managed to loot. Imagine if the British had not been around in India at the time, if that 45 trillion dollars worth of wealth had remained in this region, in our country, we could have remained a first world country. In fact, this amount could have been used for Indian development at the time, and we would have become one of the most advanced countries in the world, right on line with the other Asian powers like Japan, or perhaps even with the Western powers itself today. But the British, in their greed, in their ruthlessness, in their urge to take whatever they wanted, just like pirates do or thieves and robbers do, they took this much wealth from themselves for their own benefit, and they did nothing to give anything back to the Indians for what they took. Now, how did they take this wealth? Well, one way they took this wealth was during the British era. They used to uh, the civil they had a civil service system which we inherited, like the Indian civil service back then, which was post independence rebranded as the IS, Indian Administrative Service. That is again from the British era. So the civil servants, they used to be sent from Britain to India to govern us, and they would stay closeted in their barracks, in their palaces, the palaces that they built for themselves, and they did not allow the Indian people to come in contact with themselves apart from official matters. And of course, the salaries for paid to these British civil servants was exorbitant, far beyond what were the standards of the salaries paid to other civil servants in other countries at the time. And how was this salaries paid? From the pockets of the Indian taxpayers. We Indians literally paid these people to oppress us, to suppress our freedoms, to destroy our means for advancing. We literally, in Shashi Tharoor's words, as he wrote in his book, we literally paid for our own oppression. And another way was military cost. Not only British civil servants, even the British army, the royal army, so to speak, was posted here in India. We had to pay the price of upkeep of the British army here in India as well. So a foreign army which was imposed on us was paid for by us. The British didn't even have the decency to pay for occupying us. They forced us to pay for our own suppression and oppression. That was the shamelessness of the British in those times. That this was, and there were other means also by which they took wealth, but these were the two primary means, namely the taxes they extracted from us, which were remitted to Britain with no return back to their Indian colony. Then the salaries that were paid to the British civil servants and other people tasked to govern us, and the maintenance of the army stationed in India. All of these were under the guise of official means. These were essentially legal governmental means of looting the resources out of India in those times. Now I would like to expound further on this loot. Now, as I talked earlier, India, especially in the Bengal region, was a leading exporter of textiles. The muslin cloth that I talked about, it was said to be thin as air. It was India. We used to export these textiles, particularly the muslin cloth, a lot to other countries, and they crazily sought after all of this. So once the British, even the East India Company used to buy this. They used to pay for it in gold and silver just like everybody else did. But after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, once Siraj-ud-Dowlah was deposed and the East India Company took control over Bengal, the first thing they did was they imposed heavy duties on Indian goods, essentially they prohibit there were many means used, but one of which was in England itself they forced the British government to impose prohibitory tariffs on on imports of Indian textiles into their country. Then back in Bengal where they were ruling, they would they imposed heavy restrictions on Muslim weavers. They forced them to sell those goods at very low prices, so much so that the trade became unprofitable. Then because the by artificial means the Indian exports into Britain were made costlier and costlier, so they were no longer sought after. It is said, nobody knows this for sure, but it is believed that soldiers from the East India Company, yes, it is difficult to say, because back in those times, private companies were allowed to keep their own militaries. So soldiers from the East India Company used to, it is believed, go to Muslim weavers' houses and literally break their fingers so that they could not view the cloth. Which means now nobody knows this for sure if it is true, but yes, that was how that essentially this shows that the British, particularly the East India Company people, were prepared to use unfair means to ensure their profitability, to ensure their rule, to ensure that they reaped all the benefits from their new Indian colony while they didn't have to give anything back to the Indian people in return. Then this continued on even after the British East India Company was removed in 1757. Under the British Crown, this exploitation only continued further. Particularly during the East India Company era between 1800 to 1860, the exports of Indian goods, textiles really, this plummeted by a 98%. That's a very drastic number, almost 100% to call it. Then with all this means, so because of the tariffs that the by artificial that were induced, that were imposed on Indian goods by artificial means, then once the once Indian goods were artificially made costlier by prohibitory tariffs and also by this uncouth means that I have just spoken about, then then of course the British that took advantage of this situation, and what happened was in during the colonial era, the only use they had for India was the raw materials they produced. There are, for instance, the farmers that were used to grow foodstuffs like rice or wheat and all. When the East India Company, when the British took over these lands, essentially another way was the taxation system. During the British in before the British era, the the tax imposed on the farmers used to be on the basis of how much crops they grew. For instance, if they could grow only this much crops, whether it be due to famines or, for instance, if they had a social function like weddings and all, then then the tax collectors would be lenient and take all of these factors into account. The British collectors did none of such things. They appointed zamindars to administer these lands. This happened when they went to collect tax from farmers. They did not allow farmers any concession for famines or social functions. They would ruthlessly collect these taxes from farmers, and if the farmers couldn't collect, the lands would be confiscated and auctioned off, or to other peoples. These people would be appointed as zamindars or landlords, who would in turn supervise the farmers who once owned these lands but now who had to till on lands that were now owned by others on account of no fault of their own, on account of a system they just couldn't understand. So what happened was, once as part of their ruthless profit making venture, the British had the zamindars use the farmers to, instead of growing food crops, to grow cash crops like indigo. Indigo is one of the ingredients used in textile manufacturing. So this indigo that was produced, the British would then take the indigo out of India. They would buy this indigo at abnormally low prices, thus ensuring that the farmers remained impoverished even despite whatever they had earlier, whatever they had been robbed of, despite all the effort they put. So once this indigo was taken out of India, the British would use this indigo to manufacture textile in their textile mills in England, which were horrors in themselves during those times. What with workers being British workers being used and discarded like how we discard tools after it's no longer in use. That was how it was here. So British, so the text, so once this cloth was produced in these mills, this cloth would then be exported back to India and sold at abnormally high prices. Now, so what happened? Not abnormally high prices, but the thing is, even though this was sold at high prices, this the British ensured that their cloth was still cheaper than the Indian produced cloth, which means that not only the tariffs on the Indian goods, but also the the import of British goods which were artificially sold at lower prices, and if Indian rulers dared to impose tariffs on these goods, the British would make a fuss and ensure that the tariffs on their goods was eliminated by whichever Indian rulers they forcibly suborned. So this British textile imports into India, it surged, it flooded local markets, it wiped out our flourishing Indian textile industry and live and millions of artists, a textile industry. So essentially, only the British companies producing this cloth benefited from this industry. Millions of Indian weavers who had who had earlier had this as a livelihood, as a source of beneficial gain for livelihood. What happened was many times these Indian artisans they used to during the crop growing season they would grow the crops, and during the season when crops could not be grown, they used to view cloth and sell it. But because of the British system, the Indian cloth became unprofitable to sell. So these weavers lost their business and were forced to turn to farming as their full-time occupation. And what happened was, because the agricultural lands became overcrowded, so the land became overused, the fertility of the land declined. So the land, the productivity, the agricultural productivity of the country also declined. And like I said earlier, because because farmers increasingly became poorer and poorer and increasingly became and could not pay the taxes that were so ruthlessly demanded by the British collectors. So the many of these farmers lost their land. It was handed over to zamindars, and these landless farmers became laborers in their what was their own land, now administered by somebody else on behalf of the British. Essentially, the landless peasant phenomenon, which unfortunately plagues India even today. Yeah, that was a legacy of the war, what the British did. We can most thank the British for this landless farmer problem that still plagues us today. And when it comes to the weaving, India, even today we still prefer Western cloth to Indian cloth. Indian cloth, although it is the situation being somewhat remedied now, Indian cloth is again gaining traction, but still Western clothes are far more worn all over the country than our own Indian made ones. Again, the British can be thanked very much for this. So now I talked about this. Now, as I said earlier, the landless peasant phenomenon was caused by ruthless British taxation and extortion of our resources, particularly how they made no concessions to Indian farmers for their situation, because the British did not bother to really ingratiate themselves with the Indian people. They didn't have to. Once they served a term in India, they had to go back to Britain, where they didn't have to think about India. So yes, that's that. Then along with all this, the British also forced us to export our food grains and all to their country and to other countries for the British rulers' own profitability. regardless of what was the situation on the ground, regardless of whether the Indian people had food available to them or not. So what happened was, for instance, if there was no rain, if there was a drought situation, then in normal circumstances, when there is a drought situation, the British, it is the policy of any government that that food must not be taken out of any drought-stricken region. That the food must be kept there uh, and preferably given for free to the suffering people, or at best given at a very concessional price. But during the colonial era, the British didn't do any such things. At the height of the famines, the British, they would export food grains from their warehouses rather than giving it to the starving people, which means the British remained focused on profit at the expense of the lives of the Indian people. Scores of Indian people died needlessly in a lot of famines that happened over the British era. So essentially, the lack of food due to droughts and all, it was exacerbated into a famine-like situation, largely because of colonial policy of ruthless extortion and exportation of food grains. And not only that, even during this drought-like situation, the British used to sell the food grains to Indians at very high prices, when policy normally demands that the prices either not be charged or be charged at very low rates. The British, however, in their greed for profit and uh, wealth, they chose to sell goods at high prices even in times of famine. So a lot of famines happened over these years. Famine number one, this happened in Bengal. It was called the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. So what had happened was, now as I said earlier, once the British East India Company did the work of destroying the livelihoods of Indian artisans and weavers, and driving them to the land, when it comes to existing farmers also, they forced them to collect higher taxes, and if they did not do so, then their lands were confiscated and auctioned off to other people who became landlords and were sold, and the peasants who once owned their land now became landless and became mere laborers working on the very land they once owned. And of course, a certain amount would be collected from these people by the zamindars or land owners, who then would pay the necessary rent to the British regardless of the situation that was going on. So the East India Company, like all companies, was all about profit, and unlike most modern day companies, this company had the political power as well to impose unfair, dishonest taxation policies to ensure that it got the wealth it desired. So all this culminated in 1770 into the Great Bengal Famine. What happened was, even with uh, with the food shortages and with people dying, the East India Company not only chose to maintain the amount collected from the land by the zamindars as it is, but they even chose to triple the amount. So during this period, some 10 million of our people died in Bengal. And of course, the East India Company did not get off scot-free from this also. It is said that the shares of the East India Company fell in value by a lot. So essentially, the company became unprofitable. So this was around the time when the people started calling into question the East India Company's policies towards Bengal, and calls were made to moderate the exploitation. Of course, not end it. Even the British people benefited from it somewhat, but just to moderate the whole thing a bit, so that not to ease the suffering of the Indian people, but just so that they could continue their extraction as it was. This was in 1770. The very first famine that gripped India, a mere 13 years, mind you, after the Battle of Plassey. Just within 13 years after the British rule in India began in Bengal, famines had already become an integral part of the Indian landscape during the British age. Then in 1783 again, 13 years after this famine, across North India. Apparently, this was shortly after the Battle of Buxar and after the British waged several battles across North India for their conquest, and of course to ensure their profitability and all, to ensure that they could continue to gain more wealth. So another famine was introduced again because of the British policy of not only refusing to sell to provide relief to the Indian people during famine situation, but literally exporting foodstuffs to other countries in pursuit of their own profits, regardless of the suffering of the people. So well, again, across North India, the Chalisa famine happened, and this famine claimed something like 11 million lives. Wow! The apparently even the great the numbers not only remained the same as the famine that happened earlier in Bengal, but which was around 10 million, but now it had risen even more by 11 million. Again, despite famines becoming common, the British did not alter their policies because they did not want to develop the Indian colony. They did not care to. They just needed India as a tool for continuous extraction of resources by any means necessary. Then in from 1878 to from I think 1876 to 1878, this was shortly after the 1857 revolt, when the British East India Company was disbanded by the British Crown, and the Crown itself took official control over India. So now I would like to tell a bit about this famine. This is one I have read about. This famine that occurred, there was a after during the East India Company era, the person in charge of the Indian colonies or the British provinces which were under the British jurisdiction directly, the head person used to be called as the Governor General. After the 1857 revolt, when the British crown itself took control over India, the person in charge of the Indian colony was called the Viceroy. So there was this Viceroy named as Robert Lytton. I don't remember his actual name, but I think this was his name, Robert Bulwark Lytton or something. Now this man was a real, I don't want to use a slur here, so let's just say this man was a horrible fellow, Robert Bulwark Lytton. He actually wasn't qualified to rule over India, but he was appointed as such because he was apparently Queen Victoria's famous, very favorite poet. So Queen Victoria, as a favor to Lytton, she appointed him as Viceroy over India. So again, here while he ruled over India, especially across South India in the Madras region, what we now know as Tamil Nadu or Chennai, or the Chennai area, let's say Tamil Nadu. Back then, the Madras province, what we now know as Tamil Nadu, was known as the Madras province. So in the Madras province especially, and even across other regions in India, there was again a food shortage due to again rains failing. So again people started to starve and die in greater numbers. uh, and again, as per the usual British practice, the British continued exporting the grains they held in their warehouses to other foreign markets. The British this Viceroy Robert Bulwark Lytton, he couldn't care. He could care less about the suffering of the Indian people on whom he had been he had been put in charge of. So this Robert Bulwark Lytton, he continued exporting grains ruthlessly, and when one of his subordinates, a man named Richard Temple, I believe, he tried to in one of his regions that he was tasked to administer, he tried to impose some relief measures such as stopping the exports of grains and trying to relieve the Indian people. He He was widely criticized in the British newspapers for this. Essentially, he was criticized for being a humanitarian. The horror of these people, that they should criticize a man for trying to do good to the people he was tasked to administer, whose welfare he was tasked with. Then, obviously, because of all this, Richard Temple had to modify his policies later. But coming back to this famine, up to nearly 8.2 million people died during this period. Again, a staggering number. So that is it. And then when this Viceroy Robert Bulwer Lytton, he had to visit the camps where where starving Indians were housed. Not a shred of sympathy he had for their situation. Instead, he did not want to see these people at all. He said that these were weak people who could not be bothered to work for their livelihood, as if people could work when they were literally starving to death. And not only that, it when the when this when during this period the horrors were such that when even at this point the British continued to sell food grains and all during this period at high prices to the Indian people as against normal policy. So because of the poverty of the Indian people at the time, and because of desperate starvation, it is said there are horror stories of parents literally throwing their children in wells, or to spare them the pain of death from starvation, or selling their children just to obtain money to buy a sack of grain and all. And not only did Viceroy Lytton had no sympathy for this, it is said that he even dared to use the food that he had stored in warehouses to host a dinner for Queen Victoria when she uh, visited India. The Queen Victoria's Jubilee, I believe. And during this Jubilee, Queen Victoria was said to have proclaimed that she wished peace and prosperity to the Indian people. The sheer denial of the sheer hypocrisy and denial of this sort of people, that when our people were dying in droves due to lack of food, not only did Viceroy Lytton use that food to host an extravagant lavish dinner for his queen, but also said queen didn't bother to know the sufferings of her also the sufferings of her Indian subjects. And it is said that during this period, when the Indian people, they were made to work in these camps, the starving Indians, they were housed in relief camps, but instead of being given relief, they were made to work to obtain food. And the amount of rations these people were given was said to have been even less than what Jewish and other inmates were given in the Nazi concentration camps in World War II, which means that the British were even more inhuman to Indians than the Nazis were towards the Jews and all, as they are infamously known and criticized for in the West. Then the last famine that occurred in British India, this was 4 years before independence. Again, this famine like 1770 happened in Bengal, the well-known Bengal famine. This occurred during the Second World War, and about 3 million people died here. So what happened was, there was this the prime minister at that time, Winston Churchill. He was a well-known Indian racist. It is said that he had made a very infamous statement about India, which I will talk about in another, which I'll talk about later. So in Winston Churchill was very racist towards Indians, and he did not want to feed the starving Indian people. During World War II, he instead, whatever food grains were stored in warehouses in Bengal, instead of releasing them as relief to the Indian people, he instead had these food grains expropriated for the British Army's consumption in war theaters across the world, especially in Asia and the Western Africa and all. So that was that. So, and essentially there was this denial policy where it is said there was a scandal going on. It is said that even in wartime, the enemy is obliged to allow neutral parties like the Red Cross and all to provide relief to the people suffering from famine within their territories. It is said that even at the height of the Nazi occupation of Greece in World War II, when the Brit when the Red Cross offered relief to starving Greeks, the Nazis obliged them. But the British, in case of the Bengal, did not even allow for offers from the people who they considered friends, like from friendly nations like the US, their other Australia and all people they were allied with. Even when their allied people offered relief to the Indian colony, the British refused. It is said that Subhash Chandra Bose himself offered for relief to Bengal, but British censors at the time didn't even report it. Essentially, the deliberate British wartime policy, especially and it is said that now this denial policy also happened that during this time in 1942, the Japanese had occupied Burma and it was believed that they would invade India. So the British, as part of their wartime strategy, destroyed the boats which Bengalis used to use for fishing, or the boats which they used for transporting rice. So and they even used to destroy rice fields and expropriate them for use as airfields and all. Again, no compensation whatsoever to the suffering Indian people. So as part of wartime policy, and because of Winston Churchill's racism towards Indians and general neglect and all, the 3 million people needlessly died. It is said that after the war was over, when these warehouses were opened, the grains that were stored in them were rotting, which means that the British, out of sheer spite and out of policy, did not release grains which were in plenty to the people. Also, I think Winston Churchill, from his racism, it was not just racism, but also because he was concerned that the Indian colony was slipping out of his hands. So out of spite, out of hate, he literally murdered 3 million people on his watch. All because of a sentiment, irrational sentiment he had. Now, when it comes to uh, uh, when it comes to the how to put this, when it comes to the Bengal famine was the very last famine that happened prior to our independence. It is said that the Bengal famine and the British response to that famine, it is said that Jawaharlal Nehru himself once said that the presence of well-fed white British soldiers amidst what was an apocalyptic landscape was the final drive for the British, was the final judgment on British rule in India, which means that the Bengal famine was an impetus for the British to quit India, as in an impetus that caused the Indians to rebel, for the discontent at British rule to simmer and boil over, and for the British to force to leave. And when the famine happened, like I said, Winston Churchill was callous and disregarding of the welfare of the Indian people. Probably also because we as Indians were powerless at that time. These people are imposed on us. Unlike the British people, we couldn't exactly vote out politicians out of power for failing to look after us. So Winston Churchill could indulge his sentiments, his wants and desires freely with the Indian people without any need for retribution, or so he thought. Now, when scores of people were dying, and when Winston Churchill was confronted with the results of his decisions and asked to provide a bare minimum of relief by his own officials, this was what he had to say. I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. Wonder what I doubt Winston Churchill had dared to say this in the case of the British people. They would have voted him out before he knew it. As it was, he was voted out of power right after the war was over, but that's a different matter. But Winston Churchill's racist sentiments towards Indians were like this. Now, unlike other people who express their sentiments towards Indians, Winston Churchill was in charge of the Indian people, and he had to look after them. This sort of sentiment and his refusal to help Indians, all because of spite, it costed Indian people, scores of Indian people, their lives. And essentially, and it is not just that. When his own British officials in India confronted Churchill with the consequences of his actions and asked him to help, the only thing he had to say was, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? At that time, Gandhi was also starving. He was fasting. He was fasting in protest at the British. So obviously Churchill didn't indulge Gandhi and kept him in prison. And in response to people suffering for no fault of theirs, he only asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet. He was more concerned about preserving his power over India than actually helping the people he was in charge of. But this wasn't Winston Churchill alone. Other British officials also shared some of the same sentiments towards us Indians, even though unlike Churchill, they were not so blatantly and so extremely racist. In fact, even by the standards of his time, Winston Churchill was regarded as horribly racist, so much so that even other people were aghast at his attitude. So yes, that was that. Now, then another means which the British people used to rule over India, it was called divide and rule. Now, before the British came, Indian communities were not so clearly defined. People used to belong to particular castes and all particular religions, but they identified more with the region in which they were resided. India people living in one region weren't necessarily likely to align themselves with people of even the nearest village or town, let alone of far-flung regions. So what happened was, especially when it comes to Hindu caste system, so what happened was, for instance, if a man was a Vaishya or trader in his own caste and he wanted to become a Brahman or Kshatriya, if he couldn't do so in his own region, he could migrate to another region and convert to and choose another caste. It was pretty flexible. But what happened was, the British they developed the census tactic wherein they counted the number of Indian people residing in a particular region and what caste they belonged, and using official means they put people in a box in a particular category permanently. So for instance, if you are a Shudra or any other upper caste, and the British identified you as such as per the census, that identification remained with you for life. No matter where you went or what you did, you couldn't choose what else you wanted to become. You were stuck in the position you were in. So casteism, which was there earlier, but it was really flexible and changeable, caste now became a very rigid legal category under the British era. So this was another means the British used to divide us. Now, then other means which the British used to divide us was this is a very familiar topic. It's called the Hindu Muslim divide. There were differences between Hindus and Muslims even in the pre-British era, but under the British, these tensions were exacerbated further. Largely, the British did this because during the 1857 revolt, which was the first major revolt against British rule, the Britishers had witnessed how Hindus and Muslims had banded together to throw the British out of India, and they had almost succeeded. The ghost of 1857 would haunt the British throughout the remaining 90 years of their rule. So to ensure that Muslims and Hindus would never band again together, and that only that their differences would be more pronounced, and that Hindus, Muslims would fight amongst themselves rather than against the British masters. The British implemented their Hindu-Muslim divide strategy. The British often used to, the British often far more afraid of their Hindu subjects used to favor their Muslim subjects more. And as I will state later on, the British were directly responsible for the partition of the country. So, so the Hindu-Muslim divide was a very well-known common tactic which British used to prevent unified resistance to colonial rule. This came to a head in 1909 when during the with the so-called Morley-Minto reforms. Now this was this reforms were the work of a British parliamentarian called Edward Morley and the then Viceroy Lord Minto. Now, as a means to entrench, as a means of giving Indians some concessions while at the same time strengthening their rule, and as a means of dividing Indians and preventing their unification, what happened was these reforms, they allowed for the establishment of Indian legislative councils, and and their Muslim subjects in India in particular were given separate electorates. Now here's the thing. Muslim, whether it be Muslim or Hindu, we are all Indians. So to divide Indians on the basis of religion like this, to literally allow a separate electorate to people belonging to a particular religious group was was a transparent attempt at divide and rule, and also frankly absurd. Now one could go and tell the British or other Western countries that they should give Jews their separate electorates. You can bet my words, they would be literally horrified at it. They would be literally horrified at that. They would insist that all that voters are voters and that they are all citizens. It doesn't matter which religion they belong to. But here in India, the British used these reforms as a means to divide people on the basis of religion further to entrench their rule. So what happened was the conflict which had already been going on for some time between people of different religions, particularly the Hindu and Muslim religions, only strengthened further. And this went on and on further. During the British era in particular, Hindu-Muslim riots were common across various regions, with the British overtly encouraging this. And all of it came to a head with the 1947 partition of India upon their departure. Now, railways as tool of extraction. Now, it is said that one of the benefits of the British Raj was the Indian railways. In the 1840s, the first Indian railway from South Bombay to Thane was laid down by the British, and back then it used to be a private enterprise. The railways are private enterprise. So apologies for the British Empire in the West and even some in India cite this as a reason, as a basis for British rule being ultimately God's gift to India. But was it? Again, like I said, plenty of literature has been released to cast aspersion on this particular argument. So it wasn't, the railways, it turned out, wasn't in any way a gift to the Indian people, but more a tool of extraction, a tool of business, ruthless commercial exploitation and capitalism that the British used in India to extract our resources. So what happened was the railways would be used to transport the raw materials, primarily the indigo and other raw crops, and that the British would use the railways for to export, to take it to the ports from where it would be taken to Britain, processed into clothes and other manufactured goods, and then sold here to India. So again, the railways really served as a tool for exploitation. Not only that, the uprisings that took place all over India during colonial rule, the railways meant that the British troops could be deployed to any region that the British administration wanted as fast as they could to suppress those uprisings. meaning that railways were also used as a means to consolidate British rule over India, to ensure, to suppress any rebellion on the part of the Indian people. So again, the railways were no gift, just another instrument of exploitation. And we Indian people did not, we would not have really used expanded the railways on our own. I mean, we did, even after independence, we did expand the railways. Even during the British era, the British didn't exactly bother putting railways all over India, only to the regions that they deemed desirable. The widespread railway coverage that we now see all over India only happened after independence, not before. So again, railways were nothing more than a tool. But the British didn't care about our welfare. Then another important point that I would know, the British were also used, now as I have talked, the siphoning of resources from India of $45 trillion that I have stated earlier, it happened through payment of taxes and salaries to British civil servants and the upkeep and maintenance of the British army, right? Now as it happens, that monetary exploitation happened through this also, through the railways. Now, as I said earlier, railways in the British era were entirely a private enterprise. So what happened was, uh, the capital that was that the companies, that the British companies put into the railways in India, it was run as a sort of scandal. There was the investors who invested their capital into the British companies, which then constructed the railways using said capital. These investors were guaranteed 5% return on their investment, and sometimes the returns literally exceeded the amount of capital invested in the first place, which is frankly absurd to anyone who is not only a seasoned investor but also those who are beginners, those who don't even know about investing, those who know simple mathematics would know that there is no way returns on investment would exceed the capital invested. But here it did, and it was guaranteed. Unlike in normal markets where returns fluctuate on the basis of market conditions, here it was a guaranteed return, almost like government securities, if you ask me. Now, as it turned out, the profits from the investment uh, were given to British investors. But if there are any losses at all, who bore it? Us Indians. The Indian taxpayers bore the losses. So again, this was again another mode of exploitation. So what happened was, the British would take all the returns from the investment and make us bear the any losses if it happened. So again, this was a sort of scandal where it was essentially, it was guaranteed private enterprise. It is supposed to be only government which is guaranteed, but here private enterprise was guaranteed as well. So again, this was a clever and ruthless means of exploitation. And of course, even when it came to the returns, those returns were paid for using Indian taxpayer money. So again, we Indian taxpayers had to pay the profits that the British investors earned and bear the losses if any happened. Another bad thing that happened because of these railways was social disparity increased. What happened was, today in trains we usually have only two classes, first class and second class, on the basis of how much money we pay for the tickets. But back then, racism was standard. It is most people would know about Gandhi's journey to Pretoria and the infamous incident involving how he was kicked out of first class because of he had the wrong color and because only white people sat in the first class and he had to go in the third class. Now, speaking of classes, during this era, there used to be three classes of compartments in Indian railways, as well, just as it was in South Africa. One was first class. First class was the most elite class ever, and it was purely reserved for white people, mostly for the European people who visited India, or European administrators and all. and the British and they were compulsorily tasked to be in white first class only, not go into any of the lower classes even if they desired it, so as to preserve the image of white supremacy, white superiority. In stations also there were seats designated for white people and for colored people, namely us Indians. Then those of us, then the first and second classes were reserved for white people, or in the second class I suppose even some rich Indians could go, but it's doubtful. But the third class was exclusively reserved for Indians. In fact, after independence, there was a cartoon made in a newspaper about this, where the people are going in a train in the colonial era. The third class is literally full to capacity, and people are literally hanging out of the train, like it happens in Mumbai local trains today, even today. Then, but the first class is completely empty with only two British men, and they are commenting to each other that, my chap, there is absolutely nobody on this train. This implies the sheer comedy and absurdity of the racial segregation system that prevailed in the railway system in those times. And worst, and not only that, we Indian taxpayers also had to pay for the white people traveling in these trains, as in white people have probably charged lower prices than the Indian people were for third class. And during these times, as a means of ruthlessly um, enforcing the exploitation, the British, they used to they had lower, the British used to impose lower freight rates. Obviously freight rates were lower because it facilitated the 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 drain of raw materials out of India, since it was done by railway. So when it comes to freight transportation of goods, rates were lower. But of course, because they couldn't care less about Indian people, so when it comes to passenger travel, especially Indian passenger travel, the rates were much higher back then. Because of this, after Indian independence, the Indian government took immediate measures to reverse the scenario. Now it is passenger rates which are lower and freight rates which are higher. Essentially, the freight collected on goods transportation is used to subsidize passenger travel. This is largely a result of colonial policies which I stated earlier. Then there was this fellow called Thomas Macaulay. He was a well-educated British man, at the same time a horrible racist as well, as was the standard at the time. So one other horrible impact of British rule, one would say even more insidious than all the wealth looting that was happening at the time, was erasing the Indian culture. Even today, a lot of us Indians feel that our culture is inferior, that Western culture is the best and Western standards are the best. Especially the Indian elite, they usually take their practices from the West. A lot now this sense of Western superiority is fading off, as we Indians are slowly coming to terms with our own culture. But the reason why we still feel so much inferiority to the West has largely to do with what the British ended up doing to impose this sense of inferiority in us, to ensure that Indian culture was eradicated. Mind you, this is exactly what happened in America as well. When the British people settled in America, the one of the things they did was to eradicate the Native Americans living in what was now the United States of America at the time. So the British were genocidal in nature at that time. It is said that there have been documents released which state that the British had plans to replace Indian people with European people in the 19th century itself. Thank God they were stopped from doing so. We Indian people are thankfully still here. But the British people unfortunately succeeded not only in North America but in Australia as well, where the Aboriginals were completely eradicated by British settlers. So not only eradicating Indian people but also eradicating the culture completely. So this one of the person, Thomas Macaulay, as I talked here, was instrumental in this. There was a minute on education that he passed, Indian education, which is very infamous now. He said that we must at present do our best to form a class of Indians who may be who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of Indians, persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Essentially, what happened was Thomas Macaulay sought to eradicate any trace of Indianness in their Indian colony completely by first starting slowly. He first sought to establish schools funded by the British where Indian students would be taken out of their Indian context and put in British boarding schools where they would be ingratiated with English culture, English literature. They would essentially be taught that Englishness was superior to Indianness and that it was the thing to aspire to. So this was how Macaulay insidiously sought to eradicate Indian influence completely. Then the reason why this however, of course, Macaulay realized that the vast majority of Indian people couldn't be converted like that. So as he said in this statement, he wanted to form a particular class of Indians who were on the British side completely, who favored Britishness over Indianness, who were Indians in looks but English in pretty much everything else. So this was what he sought to do. Essentially, the British sought to eradicate our Indian school system, our gurukuls, madrasas and all of which used to be there by promoting English education and all. So they abolished Indian gurukuls, Indian madrasas and made it that British schools were the thing to be sought after for opportunities in life. Sadly, it is they succeeded in part. Even now, we are stuck with the British school system that they saddled us with. We haven't been able to bring back the Indian system, and I don't think it's possible now. But the problem with the British system is, first of all, the British imposed a rote learning system. They primarily wanted to produce clerks who would run the empire, not thinkers and scientists and other people who could actually benefit the development of India, because they did not want India empowered and empowered enough to start thinking for itself and probably break off from the British colony, which is why the education system was meant to produce only clerks to run the empire. And sadly, the education systems remained that way ever since, even after independence. Even they said during this era, another way of eradicating Indian culture was the British would hire missionaries who would come to India and slander our practices, slander our religions, and promote their own religion, Christianity, as the superior one, or rather their own brand of Christianity which they practiced in Britain. So they would spit on Indian temples and mosques, they would demolish them, they would establish churches, and or at least they would in the education system make it such that their religion was superior to the Indian religions and all. Again, the British, by inculcating a sense of inferiority in Indians, sought to promote their own culture, their own way of life, and to eradicate the British influence completely, as they managed to do in North America and Australia. How much they succeeded? To a large extent they did. Even today a lot of our people aspire to westernness. We speak the English language. While not a bad thing in itself, the English language is a global language now. But that has to do with how big the British Empire was, not just in India but all over the world. Then there was then obviously other things also. Now we are regaining our sense of Indianness, and thankfully the British did not eradicate the Indian people and culture completely, but the sense of inferiority that they inculcated in us is still there. We have a mile to go before we successfully manage to regain the position we were in prior to their rule, to regain our sense of pride over Indian culture. Then another means of exploitation was, now the British army obviously meant white people. As it happens in the colonial army, they also recruited Indian people. What happened now? The wealth that was looted from India in the form of taxes and salaries and all, it was not only used for British production and all, it was also used to finance the imperial conflicts that happened all over the world. It is no coincidence that once India became independent, the colonial wars that used to happen all over the world, largely waged by the British, it also ceased almost. It almost stopped. Then during both the world wars, World War One and Two, this is largely ignored by the British and Western powers. Their own histories promote the sacrifice of their own soldiers. This is almost unknown now. It is being known more and more, but it is still somewhat unknown. But our Indian soldiers at that time themselves participated in these conflicts all over in these two worldwide conflicts. And in fact, they were many times the very first casualties of many of these battles, with white people conveniently safely behind in the rear, while at the front lines our Indian soldiers took the brunt of enemy fire. Now during World War One, it is said that over 1.3 million Indian soldiers fought in that war, and and over 74,000 of them died uh, in the Allied victory, and they contributed to the Allied victory. During this time, things get even worse, that recruitment was not always by voluntary. Even if it was voluntary, it was largely because British policies had made it such that people had no other means of livelihood, and the farm did not and farming did not enable much income, again because of British policies of ensuring uh, lower prices for Indian grain. So they had often had no choice but to serve in the army. But that said, even if you did not want to serve in the army, uh, in especially in the Punjab, which was notorious at the time for, even today, many of our Indian soldiers are Sikhs and they come from Punjab. But back then, also in the British era, the Punjab served as a fertile recruiting ground by ruthless, by opportunistic recruiters looking to make money for themselves by means of commissions from their imperial masters. So in Punjab, there was this fellow named Michael O'Dwyer. During his era, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened, partly caused by him, and in revenge for which Sardar Udham Singh assassinated him in 1940 in London. So this Michael O'Dwyer, he was a ruthless fellow, horrible fellow in his own way. He imposed something called a war loan on the people of the Punjab, by which they were compulsorily made to contribute, each of them 5 rupees each, to the war loan, to the war fund, which was used to finance the British war effort in the European theatre. So this war loan, it was forcibly taken by forcibly taken by agents of the British by means of forcible extraction, so some sort of taxation and all. People are meant to compulsorily pay this. If they were not paid, they were jailed, or they were jailed and all, meaning heavy punishments were imposed if they did not contribute to the war loan. And it is said that even conscription was upon. There are stories abound in this time that people who literally ran from recruiters were often chased and were chased and surrounded and recruited at gunpoint, which means that even conscription was abound at this time. Then this is the horror story of World War One, and not only that, after the war, the Red Fort, the India Gate that is there over Delhi, it was largely built by the British with names commemorating the lives of all the soldiers that were lost during World War One. Soldiers fighting a war in which we had no stake, in which we had no business being in. One would say if we had not been independent, God knows the British would have recruited hundreds of Indian soldiers, millions of Indian soldiers to die needlessly over Ukraine. And that's what happened during this period. Not just here in World War I, even in World War II also, some 2.5 million Indian soldiers were recruited to fight for the British. This was largely a volunteer army. This was said to be the largest volunteer army at a time when the British themselves imposed conscription in their own home country. This might seem admirable, but remember, these soldiers were not fighting for their own country. They were fighting on behalf of an empire that was oppressing their own people. So there wasn't much of a glory involved in any of this. So again, 2.5 million soldiers during World War One, World War Two. Then not only that, 2.5 million. Then again, even though this seems voluntary, again this was largely forced because people at that time didn't have any other means of livelihood. Those means of livelihood having been destroyed by the British themselves, so going into the army was really the only option, which is why the British could raise such a large army like this. Many of our Indian soldiers fought in the European theatre during World War II. Then, when it comes to Dunkirk, when the British retreated from the Nazi advance, our Indian soldiers were left to their fate, and many of them ended up being taken prisoners of war in Germany. Then, even in the Asian theatre, when the British were fighting the Japanese, when the British would surrender, they would gladly leave the Indian soldiers as prisoners for the Japanese, while they themselves fled for their own safety. During the Japanese conquest of Burma, it is said the British literally would put up camps of their own while excluding the other Indian refugees from the benefits of those camps. So again, racism abounded here plenty as well. The British used the Indian soldiers as cannon fodder, and essentially they were used as dead meat in order to save themselves, in order to preserve the lives of their own people. Then during World War One, like I said, Michael O'Dwyer's war fund was there, 5 million rupees, and not just that, other regions all over India also. So something like 146 million pounds were raised by the British administration in India during that war. And this is equivalent to something around 14 billion pounds in today's time, which means again this was a form of extraction and exploitation of the British on us, forcing us to contribute to and fight wars in which we had no stake in at all, fight wars in regions in which Indian soldiers, people who had lived in farms and villages their whole lives, well, they suddenly had to come to new regions with which they were barely familiar with, get slaughtered in conflicts they didn't even know were happening, for what reason, why they didn't know. Again, this is one of the saddest sagas of the colonial era, which is not widely known and not so widely acknowledged anywhere. Even in India, it's not known much, but it's becoming known now. But in the West, even today, they usually talk about their brave soldiers standing alone, but they fail to mention the Indian contribution. A sense of lingering racial superiority, I would say. Then, as it happens with all of this, the British did not fail to inflict one last wound on India during independence. When it became clear to the British, especially after the 1946 Royal Indian Navy revolt, that they would have to leave. See, the thing is, even many statements made by Indian statesmen after independence suggested that the foundation of British rule rested on the loyalty of the Indian soldier. The 1946 Royal Indian Navy revolt and subsequent revolts in the Indian Army and Air Force made it clear to the British that their time in India was over, that the foundation of their rule had been completely shaken, and that a potential 1857 could happen again. Especially this revolt happened in the wake of the trials of Subhash Chandra Bose's INA men, in which all of the defendants ended up being released. And not only that, and afterwards, in the aftermath of the Navy revolt, one of the British, one of the British commanders had stated that if they had to establish order in India, they would have to literally launch a campaign for the reconquest of India, which means it was that widespread. The British decided they could no longer hold over India any longer. But that said, their wounded pride would not allow it. They were angry that their most profitable source of wealth, the source which they had milked as a cash cow, they had to let go of it. So in revenge and as a part of strategic means, they inflicted the partition of India into India and Pakistan, with which we are still, the effects of which, with which we are still bogged down today. So why did this partition happen? That I would like to state. Number one, in fact, it is believed that even before the Navy revolt, during 1941 to 42 itself, some British administrators in secret in London, they had drawn up a map of India post World War II, in which they had segregated what was then called the Northwest Frontier Province, which is now known as Pakistan, as a separate British base that would be in India post a potential independence of India. Apparently, the British administrators had become apprehensive that India could become independent after the war. They had taken note of the severe discontent going on. And Winston Churchill, the arch racist, the arch imperialist, who was also sad at, who was also angry at having to let go of his Indian colony. He wanted he had said on the appointment of the Viceroy Wavell in 45, I think, that he wanted a part of India kept. Said part being the so-called Northwest Frontier Province, which was his favorite part of India, where Churchill, when he had come to India, he had engaged in several military exploits. It was the region which held the most memories for him, and he wanted that part kept for Britons. And once independence dawned, it became clear to the British that Nehru would be on the side of the Russians. That Nehru was increasingly socialist and would be on the side of the Russians. Now, sure, we were part of the so-called non-aligned movement where we claimed to be on no side during the Cold War. But Nehru and his people always inclined towards the Russian side. I mean, Russia has politically been a great friend of India. The relationship's been maintained for as long as anyone could remember. But the British are obviously apprehensive that, see, the thing is, after World War II, especially after Nazi Germany's defeat, it became clear that it became clear, essentially the West and the Soviet Union, they had banded together because of circumstances during World War II to defeat a common enemy, that being Nazi Germany. Once Nazi Germany was finished, they went back to infighting amongst themselves, and the British, seeing the way the tide was turning, they became apprehensive about Nehru and his administration going to on Russia's side. So they wanted a part of India kept on their side, which would be on their side. As it happens, there was an oil corridor that used to run through the Middle East, and it ran through what is now Pakistan. So they decided that the Northwest Frontier Province, they would keep it for they would partition the Indian subcontinent on their departure. They would of course do it by themselves to ensure that the Indian people didn't get to have a say. And of course, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the propounder of the independent Muslim nation theory. He ensured that the British did the partition because he was afraid that the Indian administration would not allow such partition. So the so of course the British simply used Jinnah as a pawn, their real motives being that they wanted a part of India that was strategic to their own interest, that would be a source of oil and fuel, that could act as a strategic base of operations against the Soviet Union, something close to the Soviet Union and something on their side, which is why they chose the northwest frontier province as their base, and they would carve it as a new nation called Pakistan at Jinnah's insistence, and also as part of their own strategy, which would explain why during the Cold War and even afterwards why the West would consistently favor Pakistan over India. It was all strategic. But so and not only that, so what happened was during the partition of now there is a line that goes between India and Pakistan called the Radcliffe line. Now what is this Radcliffe line? Now this Radcliffe line is, there are the British, in order to carry out the partition of the Indian subcontinent, their Indian empire, they appointed a man called Cyril Radcliffe, a very high, well esteemed British judge. But this man unfortunately suffered a serious flaw. The flaw being that he had never visited India before, never stayed here, never knew the people, our traditions and all. So, and he was given just 5 weeks to draw up in the boundaries of the two new nations. So what happened was, because he had absolutely no knowledge and had been given short notice to partition India before he left. So using maps, using whatever instruments he had on an impartial, on a supposedly ad hoc rational basis, he drew a line. um, and the thing is, when it comes to people of various religions staying, especially Hindus and Muslims, they had stayed together for centuries in various villages, various towns and all. So across these villages and towns, Radcliffe drew a line. Which part would go to India, which part would go to Pakistan. So essentially, but this man had no idea, no ground knowledge of the realities. So he ruthlessly drew this line, and once it became clear that the two new nations would indeed come into being, people started ruthlessly fighting over the right to stay in their respective lands, and religious conflicts intensified on a massive scale. And of course, once the maps of the two new nations were drawn, the British chose to leave the responsibility upon the independent nations as administrators. We all know that the maps of the in new nations were released on 17th August, right? Well, there's a reason why it was released on 17th August. It was released primarily because the British the British chose the independence date as 15th August and then released the maps on 17th. By this way, they could push the responsibility for the disaster that was partition on the independent administrators who had nothing to do with what had happened, while the British could scuttle off back to their home country with all the damage they had done to our country, free of any blame that free of any blame for the catastrophe they had wreaked on India, this last catastrophe. The partition of India was their fault, but they chose to push the responsibility for it on Indians so they could run off scot-free back to England. And as a result, what happened was 14 million people would migrate across the borders of India and Pakistan. Not just the Pakistan we know, but also Bangladesh, back then known as East Pakistan. That was also essentially what was the province of Bengal was also partitioned into West and East Bengal. East Bengal would be known as East Pakistan and now as Bangladesh. Now there is no strategic reason why they did that, since the base of operations that they needed against the Soviet Union and the oil oil corridor that they needed to secure. That was in the northwest frontier province, not East Bengal. East Bengal was probably just to appease Jinnah and Muslim and religious sentiments. But any which ways, 14 million people would migrate across India and Pakistan, across the border to India and to Pakistan in what was the biggest migration in history, one of biggest migrations. And during this migration, people also engaged in fighting and riots and all. Particularly, not just in North India, the fighting was intense, but particularly in Punjab and Bengal, the partition regions was where the fighting was at its thickest. People fought. People, it is said, were often given no notice but to pack their belongings and set off in caravans or in trains to the across the border. Then not only an overcrowded train, sometimes slaughters even happened in trains. Sometimes trains would arrive in stations filled with corpses of people who had fought amongst themselves. Over a million lives ended up being destroyed during the fighting that happened in partition. Both Hindu and Muslim, both on the Hindu Sikh side and also on the Muslim side, both taken together. Then billions of rupees of property ended up being destroyed, and the Indian independent administrators were tasked to deal with this mess, with the British conveniently pushing off all responsibility and cheerily running off to their own country in good style, convinced that their imperial conquest had been a success and would be remembered as a good thing across history. Not only and and as it is, we Indians are plagued with the problem of Pakistan on a massive scale. The India-Pakistan conflict, we have fought 4 wars with Pakistan, and the war and the fighting is still ongoing. Even across the border, it's always tense. So the legacy of partition, the legacy of the conflicts with which we are engaged in with Pakistan and vice versa. Again, we have the British to thank for this. The British left us this last mess as a form of not only as a form of not only as a form of Cold War politics, but also as a form of revenge against India because we had dared to rise up against their rule. That said, this does seem a little absurd considering the rise of communist China, but the partition happened in 47, 2 years before the foundation of the People's Republic of China, the communist China as that we know. So the British had no way of knowing that China would become a significant communist front. Their thought was on Nehru and his administration's affiliations to Russia, which of course remained throughout the Cold War period and which still remains today. But yes, to conclude this partition was literally the last horrifying legacy of the British Raj. The last horror, along with all the famines, the massacres, and other things they inflicted on us. Then during the post-colonial era, the industrial base was left in ruins. Before the British era, we used to have a flourishing cottage industry in textiles and in other things, but the British destroyed it. And not only that, when Indian businessmen like Jamshedji Tata attempted to establish industries in India during that era, they were met with severe resistance by the British administration because they did not want Indians establishing their own industries. It is said that there was this fellow named Scott during the war before World War I. He had said that he would eat every pound of Indian steel if it ever met British specifications. So the Tatas produced a lot of steel. So Dorab Tata at that time humorously remarked that Scott would have had a bout of indigestion if he had actually kept his word. Funny, but it does dignify British racism towards Indian production. Not to mention, needless to put it, it was all horrifying. The racism part. And not only that, it is especially in the railways, this was like this. when the British allowed us to manufacture our own locomotives, and the British found out that Indian locomotives are not only better but cheaper than the British ones, they enacted an act in Parliament in 1912 where Indians were prohibited from manufacturing locomotives. For 35 years between 1912 and 47, we had to import locomotives, and after 47 we literally had to go begging to the British to set up a locomotive factory in India again. That was the state they left us in. When it comes to other major industries also, the British imposed unnecessary restrictions to ensure that their own industries flourished. So what happened was, at the dawn of independence, very few Indian industries were thriving. Much of our Indian industry had been left in ruins because of British colonial policies. So over independence, we worked hard to re-establish the base we had, but it is still ongoing work. 2 centuries of colonial damage cannot be undone in a mere matter of decades. It takes time, but we Indians hopefully might get to where we were earlier prior to the British, but it will take a lot of time. The efforts are being made by the government to establish concessions to industries, especially for them to establish in backward areas to provide employment to the local people there, and all that, but it will take time. All of it takes time. So which is why, even though most countries usually have their agricultural economies, then they became industrial economies, and then became prominent in the service sector. In case of India, especially after 1991, we graduated to the service sector right after being an agricultural economy. Why? Because our secondary sector, our industrial base, uh, was now had been damaged in the colonial age, and independence has not done much to restore it. So which is why we skipped straight on to the service sector. That said, our industrial base is being established, but it will, like I said earlier, it's going to take a lot of time. It cannot happen overnight. Then there is another thing we can thank the British for, very much so, is the shadow of colonial bureaucracy. We often complain about the bureaucracy here in India, how when we submit documents to government officers and we file applications, how those applications, they are slowly processed at various stages, how they take months, years, sometimes to process fully, and sometimes they are not processed at all of it. Then how this slow bureaucracy, this burdensome bureaucracy that we are being saddled with, we can thank the British for that again. They were the ones who built this. Now, as it happened, this was first established in the East India Company era, when the company ruled over India. They built this bureaucracy primarily to ensure that to how to put this, to ensure that to essentially to oppress Indians. The bureaucracy that we are burdened with today, it was primarily built as an instrument of oppression of the Indian populace. It was the lack of transparency in the bureaucracy which still prevails today somewhat is largely because the British designed it that way to ensure Indian subjects did not gain access to the information they needed, which would enable them to rise in rebellion if they ever got hold of said compromising information. Now, for instance, that was the bureaucracy. Now, for instance, when it comes to their laws also, let's say the Indian Penal Code. Now, the Indian Penal Code has been replaced with the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita of 2024, but it is still there. It is still applicable to the cases that were enacted before this code. Now, the Indian Penal Code, it still retains sections derived from laws intended for political suppression. One of the Indian Penal Code was enacted in 1861 by the British in their rooms with no basis in Indian reality. And one of the most infamous sections there is section 124A for sedition. Sedition, as in the British defined this section as anything which could undermine the political system that they had established in India, the government in India, anything which undermines the functioning of government in India. The British would use this system to jail political dissenters. Most notoriously, Gandhi was the victim of this section being used against him. Even after independence, the Indian government would often use this section to their advantage. The, so which is why in the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita this section has been removed. It is still there in the old IPC though, so you could still, but now if anything defined under sedition is committed, and you cannot be charged with it, because in the post Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita period this has been removed. Then there are other acts also. The Official Secrets Act, where which the British had passed to conceal vital information from Indians to maintain their rule, to prevent rebellions and all. The Indian government still retains this act for its own advantage, but the RTI Act has thankfully exists as a counter check to the Official Secrets Act. Then another thing, the today we usually talk about the Indian civil service or the administrative service as having a steel frame. We talk about the Indian bureaucracy having a very strong steel frame, but there is actually a sort of uh, anemia, you could say. Nobody really knows that this steel frame was actually used originally by the British in the colonial era to signify the strength of the bureaucracy in suppressing the revolutionary movement, the agitations, the satyagraha agitations of Gandhi and the revolutionary movements of our Indian freedom fighters. Meaning that to even today in post-independent India, we absent-mindedly use steel frame without actually knowing what it originally meant. That it originally meant the strength of the bureaucracy in suppressing dissent among Indians and ensuring our oppression. It is about time we got rid of this steel frame word and used another more Indian appropriate word. This is another colonial era phrase which we have mistakenly used. Then red tape. As I talked about earlier, in bureaucracy, even now there is a thing where if you file an application or if you seek information, the officials, they make all sorts of excuses. They do not, for instance, they do not provide the information as quickly as they can. They try to make delays, or they try to secrete away compromising information by making all sorts of official excuses and all, or soliciting bribes for information and all that. All of this is red, or all of this comes under the red tape. Red tape meaning earlier in the old day, in the old days, files used to be binded with red tape in order to ensure whatever information remained in them was kept there. They did not remain open to the people. Again, this red tape is a legacy of the British era, where the British bureaucrats, they used to keep particularly compromising information tightly bound in red tape, literal red tape. And British civil servants, as a means of ensuring the racial superiority over the Indian people, they used to be housed in bungalows which were set up at a distance from the Indian people, like for instance in hill stations and all that. And during the summer times, because the British couldn't bear the hot seasons in India, they used to retreat to their hill stations in Shimla and all, or they used to retreat to their specific establishments. These establishments, they used to have signboards saying dogs and Indians not allowed, which means we had restricted freedom of movement in our own country. We were not allowed entry in certain establishments in our own land, while the British, the people who had actually no business being here, had entry into this. Again, this is a gross sense of racial segregation and injustice meted out on us. And unfortunately, under in post independence it still continues, where civil servants are housed in bungalows kept at a distance from the people they are governing, or information being bound in red tape or other means by which information is kept at a distance. Thankfully, with the rise of the digital age, with the rise of laws uh, calling for transparency of information, particularly the RTI Act, and websites are now being maintained, and calls for information being disclosed are now being made. Information disclosure is now happening more and more. But we have still a miles to go before complete transparency is well established, even in a fully functioning democracy like ours. Now, just to say this, even today, Western people talk about, particularly Western people, but also some people in India talk about how colonialism was a gift of modernity, that it was a result of the modern age. That, for instance, the rule of law, the laws that we still use, they were given to us by them. All of this was a gift by the British to India. But that's not really true. None of these gifts were given, none of these were gifts. They were just tools that the British saw as necessary to use to sustain their rule over India. For instance, the cricket sport we talk about. Now, sure, the British brought this to India, and we Indians excelled at it. But that's the thing. The British did not want us to excel at it. The British wanted themselves to be excellent. So again, that is that. Then the rule of law. As I talked about the laws, the Indian Penal Code, Indian Evidence Act, all of these laws still subsist today, but they are now being replaced with the Indian version. And moreover, these laws were imposed as a means to of a means of oppression over India, not really for our benefit. Then talking about then another argument that comes to mind is the English language. The language in which I am telling this video, the language which we all use for communication, particularly for particularly at work and all. But here's the thing: the English language is wasn't a gift to India. It was against a means of an instrument of rule. The British never actually intended for the mass of Indians to be educated in English. They only intended for a select few privileged Indians to be educated in the English language, and for them to be the intermediaries between the British and the other millions of Indians, just as Thomas Macaulay had expostulated in his minute earlier. The English language would later on become an instrument with which Gandhi, Nehru, and other freedom fighters would use to attempt to liberate us. But that wasn't because of the British. The British just did that. The 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 British used the English language to rule us. We used the English language to liberate ourselves, but that was to our credit. That was what we did. The British had nothing to do with that. There is something called the law of unintended consequences, where once you attempt to do something, unintended consequences arise from whatever you do, something which you never intended. The use of English language as our liberation was there. Then another thing was another benevolence myth that must be rebutted is violence. That they were very good rulers. When we think of the British, it is we think of them as stiff people, or very good mannered people who have this very good mannered people with a stiff upper lip, like we see in films and all, or people with stiff manners and all that, people who are very reserved, cultured and all that. That's what we think of the British when we see them, but that's not really how it was. In reality, British rule over India was brutal. They conquered India by force. Like I said, the East India Company people literally broke Bengali weavers' fingers. Nobody knows how whether this story is true, but that's how it is. Then after they suppressed the 1857 revolt ruthlessly, and it is said that um, the Indian rebels or the our Indian freedom fighters of the time, they would literally be tied to the mouths of cannons and blown off from those cannons. A more brutal punishment couldn't really be thought of. So much for the so-called dignified British. Then we all know about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which Dyer inflicted, again a sign of British ruthlessness. And then the means that he took, there were after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, there were Dyer used to impose something called the crawling order on a street, where an English lady had been beaten by a couple of rogue Indians. But he sought to punish the entirety of the population for it. He would make them crawl on their knees, crawl literally like worms, and if they didn't crawl properly on the street, they would be flogged and beaten. Then other forms of punishment were imposed throughout the Punjab after the massacre. Then suppressing of agitations, particularly they say after 1942 Quit India movement, uh, the Satyagraha agitators, they were ruthlessly beaten. Like they were put in cold water, they were dipped in cold water, given electroshock treatments. Again, British benevolence turned out to be a lie when you realize just how violent British rule and suppression was. Then again, people often talk about how the British unified our country, that there was no India before the British came, which is a lie. That the India or Bharat, it has been talked about many times during the British, during ancient times, many Indian emperors, particularly the Mauryan emperor, during the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta Empire, or other ancient emperors, or during the medieval era, the Emperor Akbar and all that, they sought to conquer vast regions of India and unify them under one rule. So to say that there was no unity in India prior to the British is false. There was. It went on and off, of course, based on the state of the kingdoms and empire. But sometimes, if an emperor died, his vassals broke off and formed their own kingdoms. That sort of thing used to happen. But periods of unity were there. And in Mahabharata and Ramayana, the concept of Bharat as a region from the Himalayas to the sea to the Indian Ocean, that's always been there. So unified India did exist. And ultimately, when you really think about it, the British partitioned India before leaving into India and Pakistan. Not only that, another horrifying fact is during their rule, they made deals with Indian princes wherein they were allowed nominal autonomy over their own provinces. And at the time when the British left, there were some 567 independent princely states all over India. Imagine that our India was divided into 567 independent states. Again, this was a deliberate ploy on the British part, so that they thought that once the Indians got a taste of independence and realized independence did not suit them, they would come begging in hand for the British to rule them again. Thankfully, thanks to Vallabhbhai Patel and his tireless efforts, this ploy of the British failed. And we as India now exist as a unified nation, sans Pakistan and Bangladesh, of course, sadly, but that's a sort of partition we're going to have to live with. And the endless conflicts going on have ensured that reunification of India and Pakistan is next to impossible now. And what with Pakistan and Bangladesh's state as well, it's probably not advisable either. But just to say all this, all of these gifts, they weren't really gifts. That's what I'm saying. These gifts, they were just byproducts of British rule, or even if they were actually brought in as a deliberate instrument to oppress us. The fact that they benefited us was coincidental, accidental. The British never intended to benefit Indians in the slightest. They meant to extort us, loot us, destroy us, to the ones they milked every resource out of India to use divide and rule to make us Indians fight each other to the death until the Indian people were extinguished and the British refashioned the Indian colony to their own twisted taste. Thankfully, this did not completely happen, but unfortunately, they succeeded. To a large extent, we still live with this burden. Now, in his books that Shashi Tharoor wrote on the era of darkness, he has noted that what would have happened if India had not come under British rule? What if India had not been burdened with colonialism like we were? So what would have happened if the British millstone around our necks had not been there? If the British had not taken India's resources and if the so-called gifts which they brought us but which really oppressed us and modernization happened much slowly had not happened. Essentially, we would have continued to modernize as per Shashi Tharoor. A case can be made of Japan. Japan was isolated from the rest of the world for a long time, but after the American Commodore Perry blockaded Japan and threatened it, the Japanese sent emissaries all over the world, and once they learned how inferior their civilization supposedly was, they sought to modernize Britain, their own country, and adopt Western stuff on their own. They did not get conquered by any European power. In fact, the Japanese funnily would end up become imperialist conquerors themselves in the early 20th century. But that's a different story. The point is, if we had not been subjugated by the British, we would probably have uh, been swamped by by modern global influence, just like Japan was, and just like Japan, we would have sent people all over the world to find out what it was that made the outside world much better. We would have adopted their weapons, their way of culture and all on our own. Without the British millstone on our neck, without the resources being and the resources that were taken out of India during the British rule would have remained in India. That $45 trillion worth of resources that were taken out would have remained with us. We could have modernized faster. We would have become a first world country on the lines of Japan and the other Western nations as they are now. So essentially, and the proof lies in the fact that in the decades after colonial rule, we have done a lot of progress. For instance, we had the Green Revolution by which we are now able to feed much more people. India now has 1.2 billion people. At the height of colonial rule, it was around 300 to 400 million people. Funnily enough, the British said they could not afford to feed that many people. But how come we are able to feed 1.2 billion people with just the same land? The answer is simple. Because for the British, Indian welfare was not a priority. Their own benefit, their own profit was. Which is why they would make all sorts of excuses about not being able to feed 400 million people. But we independent Indians are able to feed our own people, more number of people, with the same amount of land. This is because the system of governance changed after independence. Instead of the British rulers being prioritized, it was now the Indian people themselves. So essentially, political system changing had a lot to do with India becoming more prosperous. Then, when it comes to space, uh, when it comes to space exploration, also we have advanced so much. India is now famous as being the first country, probably the only country really, to successfully land a spacecraft on Mars in the very first attempt. Even space agencies like NASA with all their resources cannot claim this. They had failures on Mars before successful landing. But we Indians managed it on our first try. And many people have noted that Indian states, India has traditionally been a very advanced civilization which has been able to successfully govern itself for thousands of years. Indian civilization has had thousands of invasions, not just British but even other invasions prior to that, but we have survived, we have thrived. So again, we did not really need the British. In fact, we were better off without them. Without a group of unsympathetic and exploitative foreigners in our midst, we would actually have fared much better than we ended up. So again, British colonialism might have had some benefits, but not much. In fact, those benefits were accidental. It's just like if a robber comes to your house, forcibly takes it over and pushes you to a cottage or some dog keep beside the house, and he improves your house and he leaves, and you end up with his improvements. It doesn't redeem all the sufferings you suffered in the meantime. Those benefits you are benefiting from, they were more incidental. You are just benefiting from the benefits the robber had wanted for himself. That was how British colonialism was, really, in a nutshell. So British colonialism was not good for at all. We Indians were much better off without the British. Had the British not come here, we would have thrived as an independent nation on our own. We would have we would have evolved into a first world modern country on our own. Now, that said, all hope is not lost. We can still progress to that level, but we still have the British legacy to come to terms with, and there is still a lot of work to do to repair 2 centuries worth of colonial damage. There is still work to be done, but we'll get there. We will become the advanced nation we once were, as our destiny dictates. So to conclude this video, we have to we have most of the Western people and even a lot of us Indians still labor under the delusion that the British era was in a sense God's gift to us, that it was a blessing. But as I've expounded in this video, and as Shashi Tharoor in his Era of Darkness book and so many other authors and eminent people in their articles and all have said, the British have found out and expounded the British era was in fact one of the darkest eras in Indian history. It was a time of oppression, exploitation, suppression, a time when large numbers of our people lived in poverty, even illiteracy, mind you. That they say that when India became independent, barely 2 to 3% of people were literate. You could go for miles on roads uh, without meeting a single literate person. That's how it was. In the decades after independence, we improved our literacy rate remarkably, but we still need to get there when it comes to 100% literacy. Then, like I said earlier, the British era was overall a curse. The violence that the British inflicted on us, the resources they took out, rendering India a third world poor country in their own terms by independence, then so much of everything they burdened and left us with. Even in the court system that I talked about, I should have said this earlier, but but Indian court, but the speed of cases that are filed in courts and at the speed at which, at the slow speed at which they go because of the large number of cases filed. That is again a burden of the British legacy, where British courts used to handle cases very slowly. Particularly in British courts, it is said that if white people, if there was a case between a white person and a native person, a native Indian person, the judgment would usually go in favor of the white person, or if punishment was inflicted on him, say that if he inflicted violence on an Indian servant. This used to be very common. British people killing Indian people needlessly. The British Empire used to export their more violent citizens to India and other colonies, where they could inflict their violence on the subject peoples freely without threat of harsh punishment. So these people, the courts would usually impose a light sentence, say 15 days or a modest amount of fine, for even if they brutally murdered their Indian servants in retaliation. The racism was prevalent in Indian courts a lot at the time. Then the slow speed of cases going on in courts, again that was a thing of the British era. Even now it is said in lower courts there are cases pending from the British era, from before 1947. Now, obviously, there is no point calling those British people from out India, because they won't bother to come here. India is independent, so they have no business being here. That's what they would say, and most of them are dead. So those cases are still left unresolved and pending. The mass pile of cases that Indian courts are burdened with, and the slow speed at which cases are resolved. Again, we have the British to thank for this. Then the racism that was there at those times, where British people literally cheer on Indian people being brutally assaulted, or it is said after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the British people staying here literally collected funds to honor Dyer. The one could imagine just how much Indian people's blood would have boiled seeing all this farce. So overall, just to conclude this matter, the British rule all over India was a curse upon us. It was the darkest age that India had ever suffered with, and we are still to come to terms with this. We are still yet to dispose of the legacy of this era completely, and it will take time. Which is why, if we are to become strong, and this era also imposed a sense of inferiority upon us, with which we still have to um, resolve. We still have to come to terms with the fact that we are our own people, that we should be proud of our identity, and we should solve problems based on our own identity, not compare ourselves to a distant people with whom we have no relation with, really. So again, if you want to build an independent and prosperous future India, we need to understand the British era properly. We need to understand as how much of a problematic era it was, how much the British distorted our perception of ourselves and our value systems, our culture and all, so that we can regain our sense of Indianness properly, that we can build a better India, a more prosperous India based on our own identity, rather than needlessly comparing ourselves to foreign systems with which we have no connection at all. So it is time we understood the British era for what it truly was. Uh, Let us all absolve ourselves of this myth that is being passed on about the British era being good, and understand it for the dark era it was, and to build a better India on the basis of this burden, or to cast off the burden of colonialism, to reclaim our identity and to build a better India. So I hope those of you watched this video have all been enlightened by what I said in this video. I know there are a lot of articles and books on this, so my video is not particularly new, but still I hope those of you will watch this video, and those of you who have labored under the myth of British rule being benevolent, our education system is at fault for this also, because much of the horrors of the British Raj are not really covered under the present education system. They need to emphasize the famines and other atrocities that were visited on us. That way we can fully understand the sacrifice our Indian freedom fighters made, understand just how much they sacrificed for us to live in this independent India we live in. So I hope this video helps those of you who did not know about this, so that you are all enlightened. And those of you who have read books and articles about this subject, you get a nice recap. And thank you all for watching this video. Please subscribe to my new history channel at Siddharth History. Please like, please watch this video, like it, comment on it, and do recommend it to anyone else you know, and recommend my channel as well. I thank you all for watching this video. Thank you all. Thank you.